Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the conclusion of our NEA Big Read celebration of Toni Morrison's spellbinding book, Beloved. Little did we know when we first selected Beloved that the book would come under such fire this election year. We in the library community know that Beloved has a place not just in the literary canon, but also in our debates about racism and its manifestation in our institutions. Farah Jasmine Griffin, in a recent Washington Post article, wrote, "Literary history is full of complex, difficult books, replete with scenes of sex and violence, often told in controversial, if beautiful language. The most sophisticated of these works do not sensationalize violence, nor do they insist that the readers put themselves in the place of the characters, but instead they encourage us to bear witness to the suffering of others." We have in our midst today the author of that article, Farah Jasmine Griffin, who embodies the spirit and marvel of Black literature, art, and culture. She inspires us to read until we understand, a phrase her father coined and became the genesis of her future scholarship. Read until you understand the profound wisdom of Black life and literature is also the title of her most recent book. In this extraordinary work, Farah Jasmine Griffin combines memoir, art, and history to shed light on spectacular contributions of Black writers, thinkers, and artists such as Romari Bearden, Malcolm X, Toni Morrison, and Marvin Gaye to propel our understanding of justice, self-determination, beauty, joy, and mercy. Farah Jasmine Griffin is the recipient of a 2021 Guggenheim Fellowship, the Chair of African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies, the Director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies, and the William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature and African American Studies at Columbia University, and the author of numerous articles and books. We had the pleasure of selling the books tonight, so please purchase a copy. Farah Jasmine has agreed to stay on to autograph them. The Q&A session will be after her presentation, so please hold your questions till then. Thank you once again, and without further ado, here is Farah Jasmine Griffin.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming out on a Monday night when the weather is changing. We're actually beginning to have autumn. I'm thrilled to be here. I want to thank everyone who made it possible for me to come. And I'm very pleased, especially pleased. Yeah, is that better? Okay. I'm especially pleased to be part of a big read, to be here at the library. I love libraries. I got my first library card when I was 3 years old, encouraged by my father. And I love the idea of a big read because reading is a solitary pleasure, but it's always really wonderful to do it together in community as well. So, as you've heard, when in August I agreed to join you this evening, I did so out of a desire to meet with readers who had devoted time to reading Toni Morrison's Beloved. I jumped at the invitation to talk about my own recent work, Read Until You Understand the Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature, in relation to Morrison's writings. I was also excited to follow Dr. Valerie Smith, president of Swarthmore College, who's also a Morrison scholar and who opened up the events here. I have known Valerie for a very, very long time, since I was a college student, and she has long been a kind of professional big sister to me, and I followed in her footsteps in more ways than one, so it's perfectly fitting that I'm following in her footsteps here. At the time of the invitation and my acceptance, none of us had any way of knowing that Morrison's novel was going to emerge once again at the center of controversy. It's not the first time that's happened, and I can guarantee you it won't be the last either. Morrison's books are among the most widely banned books from different state houses and places all throughout the country. She had grown quite used to that. But I do think that we are surprised that it's emerged again in the midst of a gubernatorial race in Virginia. But here we are. And I've read a lot about Beloved in this past week. And as you've heard, I've also authored an op-ed about the controversy and the novel, which I'd be more than happy to talk about in Q&A if you want. But all of this makes me even more appreciative of the opportunity to be with people who have actually read the text and therefore have very thoughtful and, more importantly, informed responses to it. Morrison devoted much of her life to protecting the rights and safety of writers who risk censorship and worse. She understood that attempts to silence writers, attempts to silence any artists, are authoritarian in nature. These efforts endeavor to keep citizens ignorant, if comfortable. In an essay titled Peril, which was originally delivered, I think, in 2008, when she received the Penn Borders Literary Service Award, and then later published as the opening essay in her last collection of essays, The Source of Self-Regard, which was published in 2019, just months before her dying. She warns of political efforts to censor writers, and that essay is titled Peril. And I just want to share with you some of the language from that essay. She opens it, the first sentences are, authoritarian regimes, dictators and despots are often, but not always, fools. But none is foolish enough to give perceptive, dissident writers free range to publish their judgment or follow their creative instincts. They know to do so is at their own peril, end quote. So for writers who document uncomfortable truths are always a threat and a danger in unfree societies. Morrison closes that essay with the following. She writes, quote, a writer's life and work are not a gift to mankind. They are its necessity. I believe that to be true, especially in Morrison's own writing. I believe it is a necessity to us collectively, and I know it has been a necessity to me personally. I think her work, her creations, her observations, and her words still have much to teach us. I know they've taught me a great deal. No single writer has been more important to my development as a thinker, a scholar, a writer, and a person than has Toni Morrison. And that's saying a lot because I read a lot. But in our time together this evening, I want to share with you a few of the concerns of my book, especially as they have been shaped and informed by Toni Morrison. And along the way, I'm going to talk about several different Morrison works, but I'll always try to return to Beloved, since that's our common text. And it is my hope that now that you've read Beloved, hearing about the ways that it picks up and builds upon or initiates concerns of these other works, that will make you want to read or reread them as well. Read Until You Understand is actually dedicated to Toni Morrison. So if you get it and you look at the dedication and you see TM, that's Toni Morrison. And I did that as a kind of homage to the way she often dedicated her books to initials. And then those of us who are, obsessed with her would go running around trying to find out who they were. But I'll tell you, the TM is Toni Morrison. The book is in many ways shaped by my understanding of what I've read of her. And her novels are not only the subjects of my discussion, but they help shape my thinking as well. So the two dominant threads in my book are the figure and influence of my father, who left me a note in a book, a paperback book, when I was 9 years old, telling me to read the book until I understand. And he said, you may not understand it at first, but read it and understand, right? And unfortunately, my father passed away that year. And so it became a kind of lifelong pursuit for me. So the two Dominant threads in the book are the figure and influence of my father, Emerson Griffin, and the novels and essays of Morrison. Her work, in fact, appears in almost every chapter, although I talk about numerous other writers and artists and musicians. Even when it is not evident, she has helped me to shape the very framing of the book itself. In the opening pages, I write, in the questions that I raise throughout these pages, I have been deeply influenced by a lifelong intellectual, aesthetic, political, and spiritual engagement with the writings of the late Toni Morrison. Informed by her writing, I ask a series of questions of selected works by Black writers. In the midst of a hostile society, a society that has wanted our labor or our death, we live in pursuit of justice, in pursuit of freedom, and longing for a bit of grace. And the questions that I raise are, how shall we live? How shall we treat each other? How shall we treat our compatriots, some of whom are guilty of crimes against us? These questions emerge from my own life's experiences, my scholarly research and my reading, but most especially my reading of Toni Morrison. Every time I read one of Morrison's books, I find passages that seem to imply, once upon a time, there was a people. And then she records this people's speech, their poetry, their habits of mind, and she mines both diction and syntax in order to get at the larger philosophical and ethical implications of that language that we might throw away as being vernacular or bad English. She knows that meaning exists in the language we use. So here's just one example, and I'm sure you can find more in Beloved, but here's one example from her first book, The Bluest Eye. The novel is sometimes narrated by a 9-year-old girl named Claudia McTeer. And she relays the story of Pecola Breedlove, a foster child who comes to live with the McTeer family and who later gives birth to her father's child. Earlier in the novel, Claudia recalls, and I quote, outdoors, this is after she hears that Pecola has been thrown outdoors, right? Outdoors. Outdoors, we knew, was the real terror of life. The threat of being outdoors surfaced frequently in those days. Every possibility of excess was curtailed with it. If somebody ate too much, he could end up outdoors. If somebody used too much coal, he could end up outdoors. People could gamble themselves outdoors, drink themselves outdoors. Sometimes mothers put their sons outdoors. And when that happened, regardless of what the son had done, all sympathy was with him. He was outdoors, and his own flesh had done it. To be put outdoors by a landlord was one thing, unfortunate, but an aspect of life over which you had no control since you could not control your income. But to be slack enough to put oneself outdoors, or heartless enough to put one's own kin outdoors, that was criminal. So it's just that one word that she then goes in deep, right? Outdoors, we knew, was the real terror of life. This sentence signals that there is more to the word than simply the dictionary definition. The phrase "we knew" asserts a kind of knowledge held by a particular group, the two sisters, Claudia and Frida, the Black residents of Morrison's hometown, Lorain, Ohio, where the novel is set, Black people in America, dispossessed people everywhere. The sentence gestures the reader to be attentive to the meaning that lies beneath. Outdoors is not only an inconvenience, it constitutes a terror, an intense fear or dread, or that which causes it. There is even the suggestion of violence. Outdoors is a condition imposed from without and within. Those who are put outdoors require our sympathy. Those who put someone outdoors are to be judged. It goes against the Christian dictum in Matthew 25:35 through 40, that we are to provide food, clothing, and shelter to those from whom it has been denied. even the least of these. To put someone outdoors is to lose honor in the eyes of the Lord. It is to fail before the final judgment. But to put your kin outdoors is the ultimate sin. It is not illegal by the law of the state, but by judgment of the community. Evictions are common and beyond one's control, therefore not a judgment on your character. But to impose this condition on oneself or upon one's kin is an act against humanity. Morrison has another paragraph that goes on talking more about outdoors. She says, if you are put out, there's a difference between being put out and put outdoors. If you're put out, you go somewhere else. If you are outdoors, there is no place else to go. She says, the distinction is subtle or final. Outdoors was the end of something, irrevocable, right? She says, our peripheral existence, and this is Claudia, a really precocious 9-year-old, our peripheral existence, however, was something we had learned to deal with, probably because it was abstract. But the concreteness of being outdoors was another matter, like the difference between the concept of death and being, in fact, dead. Dead doesn't change. Outdoors is here to stay. So this is Claudia, the girl storyteller, the burgeoning artist who interprets the meaning for us. She gives us the words irrevocable, final, concrete. The terror of outdoors exacerbates and underscores a social condition. So Morrison takes a common word from the Black vernacular. She translates it. She reveals its depth and dimension, and in so doing reveals the depth and dimension of the people who use it. It's a throwaway phrase containing a people's worldview, a fear that is universal, an ultimate dispossession, one that causes a psychic scarring. To have been put outdoors is to have experienced a major trauma from which one is never fully recovered. Those of you who have listened to Billie Holiday might know a song called Billie's Blues. And in that song, there's a phrase, she says, he put me outdoors, right? You can go home and look it up tonight on YouTube. He put me outdoors. But after listening to Claudia's kind of rendition of what outdoors means, we realize that Billie Holiday is identifying an act of betrayal beyond the end of a romantic relationship. It is a physical act that instills a psychic wound. And no one in the bluest eye is more outdoors than the child, Pecola Breedlove. She's outdoors in relation to everything surrounding her. She has no control of it, out of it. Her father twice puts her outdoors, first by burning up their house, putting him, quote, beyond the reaches of consideration. And it is the trauma of this dispossession that contributes to stripping the child's self, which makes her completely vulnerable to others, undesired and unloved. But throughout her literary career, Morrison portrays moments that are governed by what I also refer to as an ethic of care. Her expressions of goodness are most often guided by an ethic of care. Goodness, the good, is the opposite of putting someone outdoors. Claudia and her sister, because they are the recipients of love as, quote, thick and dark as Alaga syrup, end quote, they are recipients of a kind of care, especially during times of illness. Because they are the recipients of it, they freely give it to others in need. So when the foster child, Pecola, comes to live with them, they care for her. They take care of her. They feed her. They dote upon her. They enact an ancient hospitality by treating their guest well, making her comfortable, giving her a sense of home in order to counter the trauma of having been put outdoors. They make her laugh. They give her graham crackers and milk. And most importantly, they ask nothing of her in return. And as a result, they grow. They grow in their effort to comfort and care for Pecola. They are nurtured in love and governed by an ethic of care. And in the process, they are transformed. I believe it is this kind of ethic of care, this desire to protect and house and nurture, the Black stranger in their midst that leads Setha and Paul D and Denver to take in the strange woman, beloved, when she appears out of nowhere. Morrison tells us Paul D did not press the young woman with the broken hat about where she came from or how come. If she wanted them to know and was strong enough to get through the telling, she would. What occupied them at the moment was what it might be that she needed, right? And given their history and their own experience, they are concerned about a young Black woman alone on the road at night by herself. And so they don't even question her at all. And instead of being concerned about where she came from, they are most concerned about what she needed. One of the values that I consider in chapter 2 of my own book is a question of mercy. And while I focus on Morrison's novel of the same name in that chapter, I think we find meditations of mercy throughout her entire body of work. What is mercy? One definition is being spared the punishment you deserve. There's a distinction between mercy and grace. Mercy is you did wrong, but you aren't punished for it. Another definition of mercy is the compassion that human beings grant to one another or to another one who is within their power to harm or punish. Right? One instance of this kind of mercy in Beloved might be the encounter between Amy Denver and Seth. Neither are free. Amy Denver, if you recall, is the white indentured servant who has decided to flee rather than serve out her full term of indenture. Setha is a pregnant fugitive slave. In a play or commentary on Huckleberry Finn and Jim, because that's what Amy Denver and Setha are on that river, Morrison has the two women meet there and try to find freedom. Now, Amy, because of the Fugitive Slave Act, could very well turn Setha in. It's within her power to do that. And even though she is not free, she's indentured, she's white. And she knows it. And Morrison doesn't romanticize that about Amy. Amy can be quite racist in some ways, right? And yet, she decides instead to comfort Setha, to try to heal Setha's back, the wounds, and to help her deliver her baby. And Setha, in turn, names the newborn after the woman she calls the white girl. And Denver can't stop hearing the story of her own birth, right? And who she's named for. When later Setha is recounting her story to Paul D, she tells him that a white girl helped her, and he says, well, she helped herself too, right? That there is transformation in the possibility of providing mercy when you are capable of doing it. While other chapters of Read Until You Understand explore issues of justice, rage, resistance, joy, and death in my own life and in the work of Black writers, including Morrison, perhaps for our purposes, it is the chapter on love that is most relevant. Toni Morrison took up the mantle of exploring the possibility of all kinds of love and the existence of lovelessness. While her entire body of work grapples with the meaning of love, it is in the sermons her characters preach that we find the most powerful invocations. Of course, Beloved gives us her most famous sermon, that sermon by Baby Suggs, where she stands in the clearing and she tells former slaves gathered before her in the clearing, she says, here, in this place, my flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass, love it hard. Yonder, they do not love your flesh, they despise it. It's her most famous passage. I heard Bill Clinton once almost quote it verbatim from memory. And I think Baby Suggs is one of her most beloved characters. Baby Silks calls upon those gathered to enact self-love, community love, as an act of affirming themselves and healing themselves in the face of racist brutality. Morrison writes several sermons. She also writes two lesser known ones that are further meditations on love in her novel Paradise. Weddings provide the occasion for those sermons. And I'd like to talk a little bit about them in relation to Baby Suggs' sermon. Weddings represent a community's investment in the future. They are rituals of renewal. Bearing witness to a young couple's public commitment is an act of committing to them and to a perpetuation of the group. The wedding of the young couple, KD and Arnett, in Paradise, allows the community to recommit to shared values. It also provides the opportunity for conflicting sides, the feuding families of the bride and the groom, to come together. And it offers the opportunity for the officiants to provide a vision for the future. Morrison also uses the wedding as a literary device to present the inner thoughts and concerns of the gathered guests and family. It's one of the things her fiction does, is she finds devices that will allow for an exploration of Black interiority. One of the wedding sermons, offered by a guest minister named Senior Reverend Pulliam, who is an older traditionalist preacher, proffers a distant and indifferent God, one who humans can never deserve or even truly approach. He tells the young couple, quote, "You do not deserve love regardless of the suffering you have endured. You do not deserve love because somebody did you wrong. You do not deserve love just because you want it. You can only earn, by practice and careful contemplation, the right to express it, and you have to learn how to accept it, which is to say you have to learn how to accept God. Love is not a gift, it is a diploma. How do you know you have graduated? You don't." He says, "God is not interested in you. He is interested in love and the bliss that it brings to those who understand and share that interest." Reverend Pulliam's version of love and God are almost inaccessible. One can work to earn them. Indeed, one should work to do so. But such work provides no guarantee of God's favor or grace. His reasoning is most circular. This abstract thing for which you must work is the only thing that God is interested in. And yet, Reverend Pulliam provides no instruction, offers little comfort, provides no reason to have faith that one will ever experience love, and therefore that one will ever know God. The second Reverend Meisner, a young progressive pastor, thinks to himself, quote, "God loves the way humans love one another. God loves the way humans love themselves." He's so enraged that he can't really articulate what he means, but he gives a kind of silent sermon. And Morrison devotes pages and pages of language to his thoughts, to his theology, unlike Pulliam's, which is like 3 small paragraphs. He hopes that they will see in the cross, he says, certainly the cross that was the first sign any human anywhere had made, the vertical line, the horizontal one, beyond Christianity. He says, even as children, they drew it in their fingers in snow. And from South Africa to the Algonquin to the Zulu and the Druids, all had a finger memory of this original mark. He makes the cross a symbol more ancient than the religion that has claimed it. He makes it a universal symbol across time, space, populations, and belief. He says, the execution of this one solitary Black man propped up on these 2 intersecting lines to which he was attached in a parody of human embrace, fastened to 2 big sticks that were so convenient, so recognizable, so embedded in the consciousness, being both ordinary and sublime. This official murder, he says, out of hundreds, marked the difference and moved the relationship between God and man from CEO and supplicant to one-on-one. Meisner makes the crucified body of Christ into the lynched Black body that scars American history. He makes both the sacrifice that guarantees the love of God. In his view, God's love doesn't have to be earned, it is a given. It is the promise of the New Testament. There is no mystery. The instruction is clear. Love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. He says, God loved the way humans love one another, love the way humans love themselves, love the genius on the cross who managed to do both and die knowing it. God loves the way humans love themselves. He cannot speak his sermon, but he stands before the congregation, willing them to know that, quote, not only is God interested in you, he is you. These are the implications, I think, for both baby Suggs and for Meisner's sermon, right? And they're important implications for people of faith and for those of us who are secular as well. Suppose what we call God is nothing more than a conception of human beings loving each other, treating each other with mutual respect. Suppose we create and live in something divine each time we act lovingly and respectfully toward each other. Suppose human beings are the only vehicles and vessels of grace and love. I think that Morrison is telling us that this kind of love is the basis of justice. This kind of love is the conduit of freedom. This is one of the many dimensions of love that Morrison's work would have us consider. It is this ethic of care, of concern for another human being that one finds as a thread throughout Morrison's work. More than any description of explicit sex, which is what she's being accused of this time around. Actually, there are no truly explicit passages about sex in Morrison's book. No truly pornographic or obscene passages, partly because she's just too good of a writer for that. But the sex is there. But there is also care, concern, mercy, and love, granted and withheld, and the consequence of doing either of those things. Often in Morrison's novels, the community veers far from the ideals and ethical values for which they aspire. When this happens, when they veer away from this ethic of care, they provide an opening, a vulnerability that allows for the triumph of evil. In The Bluest Eye, the failure of the community to adequately love, affirm, and protect the poor, disregarded Black girl child makes way for the father's violation of her and her own mental breakdown. In Beloved, if you recall, after the feast, the jealousy that comes from the feast is when they decide, maybe I won't let her know that those men are headed to her yard, right? Maybe I won't let her know. It makes way for the arrival of school teacher without warning and the incident that leads to Setha's killing of her baby. But Morrison in Beloved does not end there. In the first novel, she ends with that breach of the ethics of community, right? And it ends with the utter destruction of the girl, Pecola. But in Beloved, Morrison does not end there. If you recall, instead, the women of the community return to those ethics. When Denver makes clear that she and her mother need food, she begins to notice I'm quoting here, a pack of white beans that appear at the edge of the yard, a plate of cold rabbit meat, a basket of eggs. And then she sends a thank you note, and they send a "you're welcome" note. Gifts of food begin to appear throughout the spring. And eventually, those same women who begin to feed Denver and Setha arrive outside the house, first to bear witness to what is taking place there, right? And then they begin to pray. And then they begin to sing. And Morrison says that in so doing, the clearing, that holy space where baby Suggs gives her sermon, comes to Setha. She doesn't have to go to the clearing because the clearing is not a destination, it's an act of love. So the clearing comes to Setha. And those women rise to their sacred and holy duty to feed the hungry, to bear witness, to offer aid and prayer, and eventually to call out the ghost that is beloved for what it has done to Setha. I think ultimately, this is a lesson, one of the lessons of Beloved. Indeed, a lesson of all of Morrison. Yes, to remind us of human beings' capacity for evil, to remind us of our crimes against humanity, to force us to bear witness to that, but also to remind us of our own capacity for good and of our responsibility to aspire toward, to quote what another novel, Home, her penultimate novel, remind us to inspire toward, quote, doing some good in the world. I think that's what she leaves us with. How are you going to do some good in this world? I'll stop there and we can have conversation, questions, whatever you want to do. Thank you. About Beloved, about any Morrison, about the whatever you want to talk about. Well, not whatever, but
Thank you. That was very inspiring. I'm going to have to reread it for the third time. I wanted to know, you talked about outdoors. Was outdoors a theme in Sula, which was one of my favorite Toni Morrison books, do you think?
interesting. So I don't know. Well, here's where it was. It wasn't a theme in the way that it is in The Bluest Eye. And I also think that The Bluest Eye is set during the Depression. And I have a feeling that that was a vernacular phrase of that period, which is why it appears in that Billie Holiday song too, right? That it's about dispossession, right? So I don't think that it's, there are people who are put outdoors so much there, except the community itself is, because if you recall in Sula, it opens with the uprooting of the blackberry bushes, right? And the uprooting of that community for urban renewal. And so I think that that theme of dispossession is certainly there. Now, I do think, though, that Morrison's attention to kind of the ethical dimensions of community is clear in Sula. And the way we see it, it's an interesting moment. It's when they determine that Sula is evil, right? When they make Sula their scapegoat, then they begin to, act in ways that they probably should be acting all along, right? So that's where her attention to the ethical dimensions come in. They become better mothers, better wives, better husbands, right? But not acting ethically towards Sula, for instance. Yeah, it's my favorite novel. One of my favorites too. I think it's her perfect novel. Yeah. Other thoughts, questions, Beloved, Sula? Yes. Oh, wait, so I can hear you.
But I was often unclear about what the character of Beloved was supposed to represent. If she was the ghost of the child come back, or she and in haunting Setha, which seemed sort of obvious, or if she was a force a kind of a malevolent force
Yeah.
in some way, or if we were meant to have sympathy for her as well. It seemed maybe a lot of all of it at different times. I just was sort of unclear.
I think you're right. I think that she's all of those things. I mean, I think Morrison says, one of the things, talk about what is justice. And she says, who the only person who could determine whether what Setha did was right or wrong is the child she killed. So in some ways, that character could be the ghost of the child. We know that the ghost of the child haunts the house. But Beloved herself tells us that, Stampede, the character, is one of my favorite characters in the novel. He listens to all those voices that he hears. It's not just an individual voice. He hears a clamoring, right? When Beloved comes, he hears a clamoring, and he calls them the black and angry dead. Right? And so I think that Beloved not only represents the baby who's killed because her mother doesn't want her to face the terrors of slavery, right? But that she also, in some ways, is that black and angry dead. And he says, he starts naming them in this kind of grotesque way: the burned ones, the ones who drowned. Even Beloved herself, when she gives her only kind of long first-person narration, what she's remembering and what she's recounting is the middle passage. She's not recounting her memory as the little baby who just started crawling, right? She's remembering being in the water. She's remembering being on the ship. And so I always think of her as both the individual, but also the collective that Stampede calls the black and angry dead. And that's the haunting that Morrison talks about haunts the nation. It's interesting. The Toni Morrison Society has and partly it haunts the nation because the nation refuses to confront it, right? And in 1987, she said, there are no monuments. There's nothing to talk about what happened here. It doesn't exist. And she has a phrase where she says, there's not even a bench by the road where you can sit and contemplate it. And so the Toni Morrison Society has started these projects where they put bench by the road in different places where slavery was important, and I find it so interesting that we're now in a kind of period with all this talk about monuments and what they mean, right? And whether or not we'll be a nation that has new monuments, and what do we do with the old monuments? That she was thinking about monuments in 1987, and Beloved is in some ways a monument. It has a dedication like a monument, right? Like a memorial to not just the baby, Setha's baby, but to all those collective people. So, and I understand why you're confused. It's confusing. Absolutely. Any other questions? Zoom questions? Yes. Oh, there's a question over here. Yeah.
This is pretty much about all of her works, not just, I think the Floyd and what happened with that whole put new light on her works and got people interested in her works. And I know I came from a background when I probably didn't know who she was because I was shielded from her works or not, introduced to them because there were themes that suburbia and people who lived certain lifestyles didn't want me to know. And I think, do you think that this sheds new light and there's new interest and that there's relevance, that what happens in the world gives a relevance to the works today?
Yeah, I think, so I think a few things. That's a great question. And I think of almost any American writer, Morrison, there's probably interest in Morrison more than just about any American writer, from all over the world. Wherever I go in the world, I see Toni Morrison translated. I get young people writing me from Asia, Africa, all over wanting to study Morrison. So I think that she is probably the most well-known American writer. But having said that, I think that these moments bring a resurgence of interest in her. So even this controversy just recently, which really isn't about her, has made more people read her, right? More people want to read Beloved again. And so I do think that these things will be a reason why people read her. And then I think people come to her in different ways, like people who love Faulkner, because she loved Faulkner, end up coming to Morrison through Faulkner. People who love Virginia Woolf end up coming to Morrison. Like there are all these ways that people come to her. And certainly what happens in our world around issues of race and memory bring people to her as well. Yeah. Oops.
So you were featured in the Toni Morrison documentary, Pieces I Am. Can you tell us about how that came to be and your experience on that?
So anyone who knew her knew that she was very private and did not often tell much about herself and her life. And if anyone knew that you knew her, people would always try to find out something about her. So when I got the call from the filmmaker to be interviewed for this film, I called her and I said, this guy, Timothy Saunders, wants to do this film. I mean, it happens all the time. And he's trying, he wants me to talk to him. I'll tell him no. And she said, no, I want you to talk to him. She said, I gave him the list of people who I wanted him to talk to. And so that's how I agreed to do it. And it was a remarkable experience. I mean, it was, Timothy is a wonderful filmmaker. It was an opportunity to talk about all of her work, the full body of her work, and also to be on film with other people who knew her much better than I did, Angela Davis and Sonia Sanchez and those people, that she gave the go-ahead for. And I realized that when I saw early drafts of it, and I saw how much she was involved and how much of her own voice we got, I realized that that would be the closest we would ever get to an autobiography. Because she always said, she said, there will be no autobiography. So that would be the closest that we would get to it. And at the time when we were doing it, I don't think I had any idea how close we were to losing her. I mean, I knew that there were challenges, but I had no idea. So it came out the summer that she passed away. And so the timeliness of it was really something. I'm very honored to have been a part of it. Yeah. And she gave us as much as she was going to ever give of herself outside of her novels. She gave in that film. Yeah. Yes.
Farah, we have a question from one of our attendees on Zoom.
Okay.
And the question is, could you explain a little bit about your writing process and what was it like writing during the pandemic?
Wow. So I started, I say I started writing this book during the 2016 election, but that's when I realized what I was writing. I think I had been playing around with different ideas. And then I got very busy doing teaching and doing administrative work. And I'd steal away and write little parts of it. And I'd write, if I had a weekend, I'd write a little section. And, I had all these little pieces that I was writing over that period of time. And then the pandemic struck and all of my travel stopped. And that was, like all of you, I'm sure, I was sick of being on Zoom. I was on Zoom more than anything. I didn't mind being on Zoom with my students, but all those Zoom meetings, But I wasn't traveling. And it's not just the time you travel. It's getting to the airport, getting through security. Like all of a sudden, some time freed up and I had more time to write. But what happened was, one, it gave me more time. But writing during the pandemic was also a period that underscored some of the things that I was writing about, especially those early days when, we were frightened. We didn't know what was going on. I was in New York. I was between New York and Philadelphia, where my family is. So there was no escaping it. and there was no escaping the death, the sirens all the time. And there was no escaping the fact that that the most vulnerable people were disproportionately people of color and poor people, that the inequalities that concerned me, it was just there in my face. But also what was there in my face was how much we turned to art. People began to read more, and how much we turned to music and all the different ways of getting music, and how much we tried to be in community in spite of being alone. And so all of those things ended up, on the one hand, underscoring what I was trying to write, but also ended up being in the book. Like, without the pandemic, this would have been a completely different book. Because there's a way that almost every and not just the pandemic, but the Black Lives Matter movement that emerged, almost every chapter ends in some way. The kind of arc of the chapter starts with something very personal. In the middle of it is the readings, including Morrison, but not only Morrison. And at the end of almost every chapter is the pandemic and the protest. So this is a book of the pandemic. Definitely. Yeah. What else?
Thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. I'm curious to know let me take this up. If you can tell us a little bit about an upcoming project, the book that you're doing on Toni Morrison for the Lewis Gate series.
Yeah. So when I saw that in the New York Times, I was like, wait, they announced it. So now I'm going to have to talk about it. So that book is, that series is a series of books about individual, primarily artists, but not only artists, figures. And about, there are a number of ways that one can approach them. Some of them are personal, some of them are about an idea, some of them are biographical. This one it's an opportunity for me to delve a little more deeply into some of her ideas and to make them accessible and relevant to readers in ways that, not that her literature isn't, but I'm especially interested in her ideas about America, and America particularly at a time when, how can I say this, where what might its consequences be if it continues to fail to live up to its ideals, if it continues to fail to really offer all people the opportunities promised by democracy. And one of the ways that I see that is, I think, in her understanding, because she's not only interested in the nation, but it's in her understanding of a long sense of history. She has if you read her work, it's in Beloved, it's especially in Song of Solomon. It's in Tar Baby, one of her least read novels. She has a very long sense of history. I think it's one line where she says, the names under the names, that the places where we live that have these names, but then they have the names under the names that tell us that there was a civilization that inhabited this place before the one we participate in. And so I think that long sense of history is one that lets her know that it isn't a given that we exist always, that nations and societies have beginnings and they also have ends. And might we be on the precipice of the end if we don't live up to what we claim we value? So I think that's what I want to work on. And I think it's timely for us as readers. Yeah. I think that she is a important literary figure. No one, like our greatest writers, what she does with language, what she gives us with language. I also think she's a very important philosophical thinker and prophetic voice for our nation in the world. Yeah, so that's what it'll be. That's a long version of what that short book will be about. Yes.
Earlier, one of our audience members mentioned that she'd be reading Beloved for the third time. What books do you return to?
So I used to teach, I say used to, because I don't know, I'm not sure I will. I used to teach a seminar on Morrison, so I returned to all of them. I returned to all of them, but on my own, I returned to Sula over and over again, which I first read when I was 13 and last read like 3 months ago. I returned to A Mercy, which was published in 2008. Often return to A Mercy. And I returned to Song of Solomon quite a bit. And occasionally I return to Beloved, like I did for this. Occasionally I return to Beloved. And I also think that it depends on where I am in my life. You know, there are times in my life where I'll return to certain books more. And then I don't read them for the longest time, but something will happen and I'll pick it up again. Yeah. Anything else? No. Is that it? Well, thank you so much.